Assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much for the kind invitation and for organizing this day of discussion and presentations. I was asked to talk about the problem of atheism in the recent Muslim culture and society. So I will be mentioning toward the end or at the very end my book Islam's Quantum Question and another more recent book, both in English and in their Urdu translations for those who will be interested and will want to get a copy of either book. But the presentation is really about atheism. What is the problem of atheism in the Muslim society, and what are we to do about it? So with your permission, I'll just start. May I ask just how much time I am given for the presentation?
So you have half an hour, and if you wish to share your screen, you can tell me now so that we can make you the co-host.
Yes, please.
Sure. Please, the technical team should make him the co-host or allow him to share his screen. You can share it now. Please see the option of sharing the screen.
Just a second. Okay.
Thank you. We can see it now. Thank you.
Yeah. So I have titled my presentation, sorry, go back. I titled my presentation, Atheism Among Muslims, or particularly young Muslims. And within the half hour, I'll try to both cover what we know about this new worrisome trend of atheism emerging among young Muslims, what we know about the data, what are the reasons as far as we can collect from the few studies that have been conducted on this, and what kind of responses we can give to try to address this new emerging problem. So what do we know? First of all, there are few studies, but there is growing interest. There's a wave of books, articles, videos, and channels, websites, etc., that have appeared in recent years. Perhaps the earliest book to draw the attention of the observers was written by Brian Whittaker, who used to be based in Cairo, was the corresponding journalist or reporter for The Guardian in the UK, and wrote this book, Arabs Without God, Atheism and Freedom of Belief in the Middle East, and had a number of interviews with essentially Egyptian youngsters who decided to reject religion altogether and God and adopted atheism. So that was in late 2014. 2 years later, Ali Rizvi, who is originally from Pakistan, has lived in Canada in the last 20 years or so, published this, The Atheist Muslim, which was strongly supported by Richard Dawkins, and in which he laid out a number of reasons and arguments why he and many like him have rejected Islam and God altogether. However, I want to draw attention to a big confusion that occurs in this field, and that is the rejection of religion versus the rejection of God. And so many of the arguments that are given are rejection of religion, but it is put under the umbrella of atheism, rejecting God, which we know, for those who have even read a little bit about the topic, are two very different issues requiring different analyses. So you have to be careful. Are people rejecting God, or are they rejecting Islam? Are they rejecting specific ideas in Islam? Are they rejecting religion altogether? But sometimes they say, I still believe there is probably a creator, but religion is man-made and things like this. So not everything is under the umbrella of atheism, contrary to what gets written and discussed out there. A number of other books. So the books at the top here you see are books promoting atheism in the West in general, not necessarily addressing Islam or addressed to Muslims. And there's a number of books that have appeared in the last 5 years, 5 to 8 years, about atheism among Muslims, about Muslims, from Muslims. And then there was this more recent book by a Muslim, Hamza Tsortsis, who has tried to address atheism and tried to rebut atheism, and has written this book, which I encourage, although I think it still needs to be unpacked some more and requires some further work. There are a number of websites or online groups. So this is still the first part, which is what do we know about atheism among Muslims? So there's a number of websites. There's a few books, as I've just shown, but there's a number of websites that are very popular, international in scope, but many of them come from ex-Muslims or among Muslims and are popular among Muslims. They read them and discuss them and sometimes refer to them when we have discussion. And I have had a number of discussions with young Muslims, particularly at university level. So there's this Atheist Republic, which is a Facebook page, has millions of likes, and it has a website that goes with it. And essentially, just to quote from them to give an idea of what they are about, they say about themselves, we are a community of godless heathens who share their views and help each other express their atheism. There's another Facebook page titled Atheism versus Islam. So this one is specifically about Islam or against Islam. And it has tens of thousands of members, perhaps more now. It says, we are a group of atheists from a variety of backgrounds, including many who used to follow Islam. And then they add, we have organized here to refute the harmful and false assertions made by the religion of Islam. Islam is riddled with false myths, contradictions, superstitions, immoral and reasonable propositions, etc. Do we have any data on this phenomenon? Well, there have been a few surveys which are very limited and can only tell us a little bit, not that much. The first one, which drew attention internationally, was this Global Index of Religiosity and Atheism, produced by Wynne Gallup International in 2012. It was a broad survey of religiosity from very religious to convinced atheists in the world, about dozens of countries, including about a dozen Muslim majority countries. And it found that in most of these places, people who declared themselves as convinced atheists numbered between 0 and 5%. The most striking one was the one in Saudi Arabia, where they found 5% of the respondents declaring themselves as convinced atheists. However, the problem with that survey is that it had a low number of respondents in each specific country. So most of them had somewhere between a few hundred to 1,000 respondents, which means you automatically have an uncertainty or an error bar of a few percent. In the case of Saudi Arabia, the uncertainty was about 4.5%. So if you say we have 5 plus or minus 4.5% of respondents saying we are convinced atheists, you are essentially saying we have anywhere between 0 and maybe 10%. So that doesn't really tell you much. It tells you some of the respondents that the survey talked to declare themselves convinced atheists, but you cannot generalize and say anything about the whole society. In 2017, Pew had a religious landscape study in the US and found that 24% of adults who were raised Muslim, so these are Muslim by upbringing, by family, by culture, by background, no longer identified as Muslim. And that compared to about 22% for US Christians, which meant that Muslims in the US, young Muslims as they grow up, go or follow the similar trajectory to young Christian men and women, young men and young women, in that about a quarter of them leave that religion and no longer identify with it. But that's specifically to the US, and that tells you something about what is happening out there. I've been a number of times, many times to the US. I've given talks about atheism in the US to Muslim communities, and I know that there is a problem there, although quantifying it is very, very difficult. And then the last one that I am aware of, a recent one, is in 2019, there was an Arab Barometer survey where a number of countries were surveyed to try to see how religiosity has evolved in the last several years. So I'll just show you very quickly some of the results of that survey. Essentially, what it shows is how people who declare themselves as non-religious in these Arab countries, how that percentage has evolved from 2013, here shown in green, to 2018-19, when the new survey was conducted, shown in purple. And as you can see, in a number of countries, the number or percentage increased significantly, particularly in Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, Sudan also. In some countries, it didn't change much. In Yemen, surprisingly, perhaps, it dropped from about 16% to about 8%. But in most countries, there seems to be a rise of this non-religious category among young Arabs. At least this is in the Arab world. Now, what are the causes of atheism that are given when people talk to them, or when they write on social media, or when they are interviewed? So what are the causes? Very quickly, the most frequently cited cause is the existence of unfairness, suffering, and evil in the world. They say, this is not consistent with a loving God. This is not consistent with the religion that you want to promote. That there's too much evil and too much suffering and too much bad in the world. How could your God have created a world that is so wrong? Second issue is that they see God in the Quran as angry and harsh. They say, your God, the God that is described in the Quran, describes himself in the Quran, makes terrible threats that if you make even small mistakes, or what people consider small mistakes, like, you have sex outside of marriage, or you say something really bad, or you eat during Ramadan or something, then you are going to be given harsh punishments and eternal hellfire in some cases for certain crimes. Third issue is that the educational system in the Arab Muslim world is closed. It does not allow questioning. It does not allow debates about religion altogether, about any issues about religion, let alone about God. And so this religion essentially is dictatorial. It imposes an argument from authority. It does not allow young Muslims to question, to debate, and talk about. And I'll come back to this at the summary and conclusions at the end. More specific causes of atheism among Muslims, there are, at least this is what these people who leave Islam or reject Islam, sometimes reject God altogether, proclaim. They say there are unacceptable religious practices in Islam, particularly toward women: beating, child marriage. They bring up the story of Aisha, 2 female witnesses for 1 male, stoning, cutting hands. All of these to them are unacceptable and make them leave this religion. They say, how could there be no outright ban on slavery? And that it is even defended to this day by some Muslim scholars and other such moral issues. There's intolerance toward Jews, Christians, gays, atheists, apostates, etc. They say this religion is intolerant. And then sometimes they bring up science issues, although in my experience and from my readings, science doesn't tend to be a primary reason for rejection of Islam or religion altogether, or God, but people use it as some kind of a further justification or support for their non-religiosity or atheism. So they bring up evolution, they bring up some astronomical phenomena, that the Quran seems to talk about the sun moving, when we know that it's the earth that moves, talks about meteors as being some phenomena that are stoning devils and things like that. They say, the science of your Quran is really, really terrible. Now, how do we rebut these atheistic arguments? So in the next maybe 10, 15 minutes, I'll try to give sort of the general gist of how we should start talking. And I am all for discussion, and I am all for openness, and I have discussions with young Muslims all the time. Somebody has had the chance to start writing on the board. So organizers, please stop that. Somebody is putting some stuff on the screen. Please remove all capabilities or anyway. So as you can see on the screen, somebody is writing and typing. Anyway, so I am all for openness. I tell youngsters that they should be open to discussion. They should come, and all ideas are are open and acceptable, I mean, acceptable for discussion. Of course, we have counter arguments, and this is how we should go about it. The more we close it, the more we prevent people from discussing it, the more they will leave, and the more they will create an undercurrent, a counterculture. Who is God? Is there evidence for God? First, as Immanuel Kant said, if one is committed to the intelligibility of the universe, and scientists and atheists always proclaim this, one must be committed to a final explanation. God is not some mindless laws, and I'll come back to this idea, how the atheists present the universe as essentially some kind of a pre-existing pre-existing laws. God is not some bunch of laws. God is a transcendent, infinite mind or spirit with absolute intelligence, knowledge, and power. So when people ask us, we say, yes, of course, we have a definition for God. We have a conception of God, and this conception of God is philosophically defensible. It is rational. It is coherent. It makes sense with the science, with everything. Most importantly, God is a necessary and eternal being. And this comes from Ibn Sina and others, some of the great philosophers of our history and civilization, who really produced this important addition of this necessariness or necessity of this being. It cannot be caused or created. It is the primordial ground of being and the final explanation of everything. What created God, which is, very often sort of simplistic question that we get asked. So, okay, so if God created the universe, then who created God? Say, well, then you should read a little bit more before asking such simplistic and ridiculous questions. I mean, it sounds like a counter question, but if you know a little bit about philosophy of religion, belief, God, etc., then you know the who created God really is a stupid question. But that requires us understanding this idea of necessity, necessary being, primordial, final explanation. These ideas are very important. Number two, the problem of evil. And I said this tends to be the primary reason why young Muslims bring up this issue as being one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why they leave religion and Islam. First of all, there is no agreed upon definition for suffering and evil. Even when somebody kills somebody mindlessly, even sadistically, that does not necessarily equate to evil, because that may be mental sickness. So is mental sickness equal to evil, or some evil act that can be explained by some illness? Does that prevent it from being evil? Or is it evil if I am not mentally sick, but it is not evil if I am sick? So the act itself is not necessarily evil. It depends on my state of being. Plus suffering. Well, I mean, we all suffer every day. I suffered the loss of my mom. My mother died. She was 55 in a car accident. So I suffered for a long time by having lost her. I was 37 at the time. I wasn't a kid. I was married, had kids, I was living fine, but I suffered a lot. So is that suffering acceptable? Not acceptable? That an adult, well-settled person like me lost his mom at the age of 55? Is that unacceptable? That's really wrong in the world. How could people lose their mom aged 55? So this whole definition of suffering and evil, what is reasonable suffering and what is evil and what is not evil and depends on what, is a whole line of discussion. Suffering and evil are consequences of creative and destructive laws of nature necessary for life, intelligence, consciousness, and free will. So you may have to have suffering. You may have to have, quote, evil, if that is unpreventable in the way causes and effects happen in our universe. And this is another whole line of discussion. Then we need free will. Why do we need free will? Because we want to be responsible for our acts, and we want to be judged in fairness. So if I'm not free to do what I have done, then I cannot be judged, obviously, or it's not fair. And so there has to be free will. And if there is free will, then automatically it means I am allowed and able to do something good and something bad. So automatically free will leads you to some bad actions, which will lead to suffering for others or may be seen as evil. So that whole discussion of what is suffering and evil may be absolutely necessary just on the basis of free will. Suffering may be a side product of some good that the sufferer and others experience that would not otherwise exist. And suffering and evil may be unpreventable in any universe of enough complexity and meaning. So it is not as simple as, oh, the world has so much bad stuff, so how can this God be there and allow all of this to happen? That is really sort of superficial and simplistic at best. So this is how we address the question of evil, and I think this is one of the main questions that tends to be raised and needs to be addressed. Does evolution imply no creator? Evolution only explains the process by which species appeared. In fact, Darwin's book, revolutionary book, was titled On the Origin of Species. Just like astrophysics explains how stars and planets form, and this is my field. Neither, not evolution, not astrophysics, explains why things occur that way, why they lead to the appearance of complexity, as in astrophysics, the appearance of life, as in biology, intelligence, consciousness, creativity, etc., which is the byproduct of one of the main products of evolution, because evolution produces things that are more adaptable to the environment, and therefore you need organisms that are more capable so that they adapt much better. And so this is how they sort of develop, so to speak, new traits, more complex and more intelligent behavior. And in fact, Darwin himself, to quote him specifically, said, "I cannot persuade myself that electricity acts, that the tree grows, that man aspires to the loftiest conceptions, all from blind brute force." In other words, there are causes and effects, there are scientific explanations, but there is a reason for all of this behind, and it cannot just be blind brute force. Otherwise, how can you explain all these loftiest conceptions? How can you explain how the tree grows and what it does, and it's, you know, tending toward the sky and trying to point to the sun and get as much light as possible? And then we now know there are all kinds of networks among the trees underground, exchanging minerals and energy and water and whole kinds of things, and some trees protecting other trees, and so on and so forth. It's a mind-bogglingly complex and wonderful world out there. It cannot just be, oh, there's just some forces and some energy being exchanged. Evolution and religion/Islam do not necessarily conflict with each other. In fact, there are many theistic evolutionists, including myself. So this whole argument that, oh, evolution is against religion, and if you accept evolution, and many of these young Muslims who are well-educated, go to university, learn about all this, and are somehow told that you have to accept evolution because there is strong scientific evidence for it. And if you end up accepting evolution, then you have to reject religion, and that is just total nonsense. Can the origin of the universe be explained without the need for God? Some years ago, there were two books that appeared. One of them was by Stephen Hawking, titled The Grand Design, and the other one was by Lawrence Krauss, titled A Universe from Nothing. For the first one, actually, when the book appeared, I was contacted by, I think it was the Times of London, to comment. They asked a number of people to comment, what do you think of this book? Both books essentially argued that we now have enough quantum physics, and even though we don't have a full quantum gravity theory, but we have enough understanding of quantum physics, including zero-point energy of the vacuum. Vacuum in physics is a very complex thing. Doesn't mean it has absolutely nothing. On the contrary, it has all kinds of fields and all kinds of zero-point energy underneath. It just means that there are no particles. And so this can allow for virtual objects to appear, at least temporarily. And so there is a probability and there is a quantum process by which things appear out of vacuum. And that essentially, as Stephen Hawking put it, what place then for a creator? And so I was asked to comment, and there were a number of other people who commented. And I said, well, if that's your definition for vacuum, you're starting with a huge, very full vacuum, and you cannot just, call it vacuum or nothing, and then there is no creator. So essentially, materialism starts with the right laws and the right constants of the universe and the right physics. So you start with something. You're not starting with nothing. Theism starts with God. As I mentioned earlier, an eternal, necessary, all-powerful mind, spirit, intelligence that creates. So in both cases, you're starting with something, and you have to be very clear that no, we are not starting from nothing. God, as a starting principle, is actually simpler and more elegant and economical. Why? Because not only does it explain the universe with just one starting principle, it also explains the existence of everything, including ourselves, including our lives, including beauty in the universe, which materialism cannot explain to you, purpose, consciousness, morality, spirituality, spiritual life, and more. So there's a number of things here. Consciousness, materialists say, well, we'll be able to explain it at some point. We cannot now, but we'll be able to get to it, maybe. Morality, this is just essentially altruism, which we can explain with biological evolution. Maybe, not sure. But okay, you can wave your hand and say, we can explain morality on the basis of altruism and why altruism can be justified on the basis of biology and evolution and stuff like that. But you cannot, in fact, materialism rejects the whole idea of purpose, rejects the whole idea of progress, rejects the whole idea of teleology, that we are moving towards some grander, greater goals and things like that. Whereas God can explain all of this and fits it all together and is not in contradiction with physics, astrophysics, biology, or anything like that. The universe, again, going back to the materialists and its starting materialistic principle, cannot provide such an explanation because it is contingent, not necessary. Why does the universe exist? There is absolutely no reason why the universe should exist, must exist. But if you have God as your starting principle, then you can justify why there is a universe. God, being a creator, by definition, would have created and has created and continues to create, as we know. 5, are faith and religion irrational? So this is another argument that people bring up. Well, it depends what one believes. Yes, there are some beliefs that are irrational. There are some ideas, some acts that are irrational. Sometimes it's just pure superstition. If one believes in acts that have never happened or cannot happen, they say, yeah, I believe it happens. I believe it has happened. Maybe it has happened, or it can happen. But we have never observed it. There is no evidence for it. There is no record of it. And it doesn't fit with anything we know about the universe. No, I believe. If you insist on I believe, then of course it becomes irrational. And especially if, and this is prevalent among many religious people, that you hold two types of thinking at the same time, or at least in different times of your days and life. Some of it is rational. So you go to work, you go to university or labs or wherever, financial institution or something, and you think rigorously, correctly, methodically, and so on. And then you have some other thinking, which is this sort of religious, irrational religious thinking. And sometimes you're acting this way, and sometimes you're thinking this way. And that just leads people to just run away. But if one is using his or her mental powers rigorously and with sound methodology, what we call philosophy and science, both, and concluding by using reason and using rigorous and sound methodology that there is a God. I'm not just believing because, I believe anything. I have thought it through and I have reasoned it rigorously, as a number of great minds from Aristotle to Einstein did, and concluded there is a super intelligence, there is a super mind, superior mind, creative mind. Then one is not being irrational. On the contrary, one is being rational. There is nothing irrational in my thinking and in my conclusions. 6, has religion led to destruction, evil, and intolerance to the world? Because, this is the argument from Richard Dawkins, Harris and so on, Christopher Hitchens and the neo-atheists. They say, well, religion has been terrible. Religion is evil. Religion should be just completely eradicated from the world because it has only led to destruction and evil and bad stuff. Well, here's a book that appeared in 2018 by Stephen Asma, who is actually an atheist philosopher in Chicago, wrote this book titled Why We Need Religion. I have the book, I read it and went through it in detail. And he goes about explaining why religion is actually good. He says, I don't believe in transcendence, I don't believe in a God, but religion as a social activity, as a culture, as a glue that binds people and they act together is actually good. That's his thesis. Religion provides meaning to people, it encourages forgiveness, relieves sorrow in death and other highly emotional situations, gives mental strength, resilience, peace, sacrifice, promotes happiness, joy, and sexual communion, reduces fear and rage, and energizes and invigorates believers. So this is all good. This is great. So there are some atheists who claim religion is terrible and only leads to evil and suffering and intolerance in the world. And there are some atheist thinkers, such as Stephen Asma, who say, no, actually religion tends to be quite good in most cases. There are some crazies out there who come from religion, and there are some crazies who come from atheism. I mean, the Stalinists and the Maoists and all of these people who have killed millions and tens of millions of people and did so not from a religious standpoint, but on the contrary. So we need to realize that religion, in the most part, around the world, all kinds of religions throughout history has actually been good. Summary and conclusions. The existence of an atheism trend among young Muslims is certain. There's enough anecdotal, let's say, maybe not anecdotal, but enough partial evidence here and there from discussions and experience and from some writings, some books, some surveys that I mentioned earlier. So we know for sure there is an atheism trend. But we need more rigorous studies of the phenomenon and its causes. We don't know yet nearly enough about what is happening out there, what is the extent of this phenomenon, what are its main reasons, who is it affecting, and so on. There are, what we know for sure is there are intellectual and emotional issues at play. It's not always, oh, I've thought it through and I've concluded there is no God. No, very often it is something happened to people in their lives and they encountered certain things and they concluded, the hell with this religion. We need to respond to all atheistic arguments and we need to take them seriously. This is what I tried to do in the last 10, 15 minutes, just to give a glimpse of how we should address these issues and how we should interact with youngsters. Religion has become repulsive. So this is one other thing that I have noticed and I have concluded that most people, they have a problem with religion. They don't necessarily have a problem with God. They go and read Dawkins and stuff and they find some arguments against God, but essentially their starting point is they have a problem with religion. And in our case, Islam. So atheism has attracted people, even though it provides no meaning and answers to questions. Young Muslims crave open and honest discussions of religion and all issues. Nothing, not even God, should be off the table. And I have found that when we open channels of discussion, when we put all the arguments on the table, people feel much better. And they start to see some nuances and they start to say, okay, so there are some issues in Islam that I don't quite accept. Maybe I don't have to believe this, but I don't necessarily have a problem with believing in God and revelation and messengers. In fact, even holy books or scriptures, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But if you don't discuss things with people, then they will end up rejecting everything. So I mentioned earlier that and somebody mentioned my earlier book, Islam's Quantum Question. More recently, I published the Young Muslims Guide to Modern Science, and I'm happy to report that both have been translated to Urdu. Just a few days ago, a new booklet appeared from Cambridge University Press titled Islam and Science, Past, Present, and Future Debates. I am sorry, I forgot to bring in the link here, but the book is available electronically for free, I think, for the next 2 weeks. So if you want my latest offering in English, Islam and Science, Past, Present, and Future Debates, you can go to Cambridge University Press, search for it and find it and download it for free for the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much for your attention, and assalamu alaikum.